Well, welcome everyone. Um, just wanted to take a moment before I start talking about work and other things to just acknowledge where we are in this space. It's very easy for us in academic settings to get a little carried away and forget that we also have bodies and get used to just our bodies being carriers for our brain. So I would like to take a second to just acknowledge the ground underneath our feet, to take a second and see how it's holding us up, giving us that solid grounding. Because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today will be heavy. Some of it will touch things in you that might be quite uncomfortable. So if there's any sort of difficult feelings, any sense of extreme discomfort, you can wave at me and we'll take care of that. So I wanted to start with this title here, Care in Feminist Spaces, Myths and Monoliths. And I usually like to keep things fairly informal. So if you have anything that needs clarification, you can sort of quickly interrupt me and I can address it. Or if it's a longer question, we can leave it for later. Is there anyone here who has an idea of what care looks like in a feminist space? Does anyone have any views in terms of particular actions or particular ideas that are important in feminist spaces? There are no wrong answers. There are no stupid answers. It's okay. So, okay, sab dare hue hain.
What's the question?
What is care in feminist spaces? Yeah?
So for instance, how I assume is we as feminists, there are a lot of day-to-day struggles that we face a lot of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, going on a public transportation and someone is just looking at you constantly, or you have a bad experience with that.
Uh-huh.
So feminist care could be, for instance, as basic as, once all of us are back to our campus or home, we all sit together and we have a conversation, this happened. And we try to, in our own ways, make sure that the other one is feeling well. As basic as think, I'm so sorry this happened, and this is not your fault. As single of such a word, it's very common when everyone sits together, we share our experiences, and then it's followed by words that should give comfort. So that is a very basic example of care in family.
Okay, so there's an element of coming together and sharing perspectives. Sure?
I think of it as an all-inclusive space where the existence of everyone is appreciated and everyone is empathized. So that's what my idea.
Okay, so empathy is important, understanding where other people are coming from and their experiences. Okay. Something else? No? Okay. So this is how I approach it. Now again, care is not a monolith. Feminism, of course, is not a monolith. The way I see feminism will be different from how other people see feminism. The way I see care will be different. This is how I approach it. Now in my artwork, this is work I displayed at Indus Valley last year. What I did is I combined humor, opacity, and holding up a mirror to cisgender folks. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what cisgender means, that basically means not trans. It's a way of finding a word that doesn't use normal or normative language as a way of saying, okay, trans and cis are about the same. There's no moral difference between them. So over here you can see things like examples of humor. I've got this here, I'm sorry you're cis, get well soon. I've got this little piece here where I covered a mirror with a dust and other obstacles, as a way for people to actually, there was no other mirror in the gallery, and a lot of times people love taking selfies. As soon as they see a mirror, there's always like an attempt at a selfie. but I was frustrating that attempt. And it was interesting because I said that all of this was interactive. So at one point, halfway through the open house, I saw that someone had wiped the slate clean. And I'm pretty sure they would have done it to take a selfie. So that's also very interesting. This other piece I called my transition story. So I had all these little signs over here pointing to the inside. I'm just going to take a second. Pointing to the inside, saying that, oh, there's my transition story over here. These are all, there are a lot of secrets that people are generally interested in, or information that is often medical or private that people will quite often feel entitled to knowing. And when you actually look at it at the back, I don't provide any of that information. And that's a way of actually concealing information, being opaque, evoking frustration, saying, okay, when someone actually has confronted with their sense of, oh, I should know this, or I'd like to know this, but they're not given that information, that frustration and discomfort is a way for people to sort of get a sense of, oh, why do I feel entitled to this information about another person's body? And particularly when it comes to care, I'm going to be talking about epistemic care. For those of you who are not aware with what epistemology is, it is how we know things. It is our way of knowing, our theory of knowledge. So a gentleman over there was saying that empathy is a particularly important piece of feminist care. Now, what epistemology is, recognizing that different people have different ways of knowing. It's not just their experiences, but it is how those experiences come about in the first place. So say, for example, if I were to pluck one of you and put you in one situation, and pluck another one of you and put you in the same situation, your experience, the way you experience that situation will also be different, even though the actions, the environment, etc., will be identical. So that way of processing information is also important. So when we're talking about epistemic care, this is a piece of work I had where the letters that you don't see wrote erase me. And the letters that you do see were in permanent marker. And I offered an option to the viewer to erase it. And when they do, the word that is left is ease, indicating how easy it is for us to actually forget that other people's perspectives, other people's ways of acquiring knowledge can be quite different. Because a lot of the times what we end up doing is when we try to empathize, we're trying to put ourselves in that experience and imagining how we would respond or react or feel. But what epistemic care actually involves is imagining what that person would feel and react and respond, because that would be different from how each of us does. So empathy isn't just walking a mile in someone else's shoes. It is not knowing what the shoes are like in the first place. We assume that the shoes would look like our shoes. They don't. Now here, you can't do care without humility. And when we're talking about epistemic humility, you're essentially talking about a sense of, I don't know how you will experience this or how you experience this. I might have assumptions about what it would have been like, but quite often those assumptions are incorrect. Because all our tolerances are different. Some people might be more light sensitive and get a headache from light. And a particular situation with someone else might find incredibly stimulating. They would be so overwhelmed that they might even pass out. It might not be a universally enjoyable experience, for example, because of how that person's way of acquiring information, and in this case it's sensory inputs, actually works. Now this piece actually was, I called it, what kind of containers best hold trans tears? what I did is I collected a whole bunch of information that I had lying around. So I had some random pieces of art, like here I had some glue, and then I had some medical equipment which I went and bought, some pills, some blood test vials, syringes. They're off screen, you can't actually see them. And there are some academic papers there, some Russian dolls, etc. And people would engage with it as a way of trying to untangle a mystery, right? What I was trying to evoke was, oh, this is an indication of what Layla's life is like as a trans woman. What does the syringe mean? What are syringes used in Layla's life for? What are blood test vials used for? What do the Pritishka dolls or the Russian dolls represent? Now, none of these are answers that I actually give. I evoke the question, but I don't provide the answer. Now, what that is doing, again, it is presenting a sense of opacity where there are more questions at the end than there are at the beginning. But hopefully the idea is that the questions will become more nuanced through the process of sort of engaging with the art. But at the same time, the process of actually asking those questions or discovering those questions leads to an element of humility, because you understand that these things are much more complex than perhaps you imagined, and also frustration. And when there is frustration, oftentimes it is the individual who is disadvantaged, marginalized, who is picking up the slack when it comes to the emotional care. So the interesting thing that happened is there are people who are coming in to see my art. They're getting really annoyed at me not giving them answers, and then I'm taking care of them. You know? So it's a way of reenacting power dynamics within the space itself. But I didn't just do that. I also had a lot of fun. Like, I think the Earth March is coming up, and I am involved in sort of feminist organizing, and a lot of the time what would happen is cisgender women in particular would really struggle to hear a lot of things I had to say, or people like me had to say. And a lot of the times, the same structures of powers would be replicated, which were being fought. So, say for example, I would say, this is a uniquely trans issue that cis women don't face. And I would be met with an answer, oh, we have the same enemy, which is patriarchy. Which is true, but it also means that what you're doing is you are erasing that issue by subsuming it under their issue. Right? So that's a way of fragility. When we talk about, if anyone has read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, fantastic book. It talks about how white women and white feminism often erase black experiences. And there are a lot of parallels here. So in many ways, our acceptance is contingent on our own erasure, where we don't talk about our unique issues in order for us to be welcomed into feminist spaces. And as a result, what ends up happening is we end up talking about common issues, but not our own. So, and that leads to resentment, frustration, so on and so forth. And this is where epistemic care becomes incredibly important. Because when you are organizing, you have to take a step back to say, okay, these are the 20 things that are important to me. How do I know these are important to other people? How do I know there are not other things that are more important? One particular example. As a trans woman, the worst act of violence you can commit against my body is probably not what you imagine. Does anyone have any idea what the worst act of violence against a trans woman's body is? No? Everyone's too scared to answer. Take a wild guess. It's okay. If you don't know, that's a great way of showing that you're open to learning. No? Yeah?
Perhaps denying the right to, claim the identity within a family and trying to force the binary of a cis woman or woman or male.
Okay. But what does that look like in practice? Physically? Yeah.
Perhaps forcing people to change the way you embody their identity.
Okay. The way I dress, presentation. Sure.
For instance, if adding up to what you just said, I'll talk with you now.
It's okay. It's okay. We can blank out. We all blank out. Yeah.
So, for instance, how in Pakistan, they say, as a woman, you're supposed to sit like this, dress like this, and all that.
Uh-huh.
And maybe just to put trans women, you should stop dancing, you should, There are some practices because the way cis women, for instance, have the privilege in terms of lining versus maybe a trans woman, they're different, right?
Mm-hmm.
There may be different ways. So maybe trying to bring them more into the, you should dress like this, you should go and employ in this particular sector, so then you will get that respect.
Okay.
So maybe that could be a physical way of how they're trying to put it.
Okay. Now let me ask
Imagine they have the same experience.
cis women in this room. What's the worst act of violence someone can commit on your body? Let's not think in abstracts. Think in very solid terms. What kind of ways can your body be violated that would be the most traumatic for you? Yeah? Sexual violence? Yeah? Uh-huh.
Not being able to control your body or in what ways can I dress or
Okay. So that's on top of your body, which is dress. So there's the two themes that generally come up when it comes to physical violence inflicted on a cis woman's body. There is sexual violence, and then there is physical violence that is not of a sexual nature, such as murder, right? Rape and murder, essentially. You talk to most trans women, neither of those will be at the top of their list. It'll be their hair. Cutting a trans woman's hair is more traumatic than being killed or being raped. The number of times I've heard my trans sisters say, you can commit these two acts of violence against me, but don't cut my hair. I've lost count. I've even said it myself. So, now you can't obtain this piece of information through just imagining yourself in someone else's shoes. You have to change your way of knowing. You have to change your way of learning information. It's not just a question of empathy. I'm so sorry you had this bad experience. You don't know that's a bad experience. You don't know how bad an experience it is, right? And because of that, you will struggle to prioritize issues for marginalized groups within your movement when you don't know how important they are to them. All right? For me, when I see a form and I have to mark a gender box and nothing fits, it will pose obstacles that it might not pose to you. Right? And quite often, just like cis women are told, it's not a big deal. You can deal with it, put up with it, so on and so forth. Those structures, those hierarchies are also imposed on us. Quite often by people who we're also organizing with in those very spaces, right? So that's why all the time, and the reason I use humor is a way of disarming. Because, some people got really angry with me when I did this, because they were like, what do you mean I'm fragile? Which itself just proved my point. But the other thing was they would laugh alongside me, but then, they'd kind of forget that the next day. Now another thing we do. Now this is less epistemic, and this is more just the actual issues that we share. I don't think you can read this at the back. At the top over here in Urdu, it says, "Aap kaun si kahaniyan ki tawakko karte hain?" which translates as, "What stories are you expecting?" And I wrote spectacle here. And this is just a stick I found in the vicinity of the gallery. And I put it up because it's attached to me and my work, it suddenly becomes a spectacle. Oh, look at that trans woman. And this must be something to do. Maybe it's got something to do with this part of her body or that part of her body or that part of her story or so on and so forth. Although it was just a stick I found outside the gallery. Then we do things like challenge respectability. It's very common to see trans women begging on the street. But what I did is I took a baseball cap that I owned and I hung it from the top of the gallery. I put some of my own money in there so that people had to engage with it in a space that is considered quite respectable. It's not at the Signal. And very interestingly, most people would see it and sort of just squirrel away because it was really difficult to deal with. And even more interestingly, the open house was open for 8 days and there was less money at the end than there was at the beginning. Now, I didn't tell anyone what to do. I just said this is an interactive piece. The glass mirror was underneath it. It was part of the same thing. So when they're looking at the cap, they're also seeing like a vague outline of themselves in the mirror. But someone decided to take money out. I'm sure people decided to put money in there too. I wasn't watching. But it's just interesting to see how people react when you're not looking. You know? Another thing we start doing is we start making space for complex experiences. This is something I call the misery inspiration binary. I took microscope slides. I bought 100 microscope slides and I wrote misery and inspiration alternatively and I displayed them. There's often a binary when it comes to marginalized narratives that either you're miserable, you're a joyless victim of oppression, and there's no way out, and that's a story that we often consume, particularly in the news media. You'll hear this again and again and again. You find a lot of people go in, talk about their lives and how sad they are. On the flip side, you have inspiration, where any day-to-day normal mundane experience will be celebrated because you have so few expectations for this person's joy. You have a job, very basic job. Let's celebrate. You have a relationship, someone dated you, someone actually married you. Oh my God, wow, you're so brave. That's also another way of dehumanizing someone. You will also see, particularly in the world of disability, you'll see tons and tons of talks where people are saying, you know, there's no excuse for, I don't use my disability as an excuse, I survived, and which is essentially a form of objectification, and objectification, the word porn is often used, so it's trauma porn, it's misery porn. Similarly, you have inspiration porn. How you get out of the binary is to talk about joy. And not joy in the sense of what you think should be celebrated, but actually ask the other person. I gave an example of the worst act of violence that you can commit against my body. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't know what the most euphoric experience for me would be. Right? And that's something I also challenge in this space. I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm going to make everyone just sit there and think about it. Another thing I did was epistemic diversity through stacking narratives. These are my pre-transition clothing. Now I added little tiny narratives to each of them. I don't know if you can read that at the back, but this one said she thought I looked cheap. And then each piece of clothing had a different story. Some of them were about the object itself, some of them were about a memory associated with the object, some of them were about a particular desire for the object. But I didn't talk about how the object was when it was placed on my body. These were disembodied piece of clothing that I just put there. I didn't iron them or anything, I just stacked them there. And I invited people to pick them up, read the labels, try them on, take pictures. Now, because there wasn't a mirror, there was one mirror, but not a very clear one. They had to engage with someone else or try to take a selfie like this, or get someone to take a full profile. So what ended up happening is suddenly this piece of clothing became more than just a source of pain for me. That's the elephant in the room, right? There is an assumption that this piece of clothing, when I wore it, made me uncomfortable. Very much so. But I don't talk about any of that. Because what I am encouraging people to do is to look beyond that. And then when other people are trying these clothes on, they're acquiring new stories and new narratives that you're stacking on top of existing ones. And the complexity that people have when it comes to their own narratives that are stacked on top might inform some of the complexity they assume there would be for the story that they're not being told. Right? This is a bit more angry. This is when I started challenging apathy. We had a protest against trans violence. Now, if a lot of you might not know, there were 21 trans women reported murdered in Pakistan in 2021. When we see people talk about Noor, we have a lot of the same feelings. In fact, we have pretty much all the same feelings. But we also have a layer of additional feelings on top of that, which is that, what about those 21 women? Where are their hashtags? Where are their news media? Where is their news media coverage? Where are their life stories? Where are their fathers crying in front of the camera? Where are their fundraising for legal fees? Where's the humanizing? We know a lot about Noor's life. We don't even know the names of most of these 21 women. We had to sit with that discomfort. Now, I invited a lot of my cisgender sisters to the open house as a way of telling them, listen, this is really important to me. Right? This has an activist element. Everything I do has an activist element, whether it's my therapy work, whether it's my legal work, whether it's my artwork. But the kind of responses I got were things like, you can't really read it, it's quite small. I call it cis feminist apologies. And most of these are direct quotes. Some of them are sort of summaries of things that people have said. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your protest. I'm sorry I couldn't attend your vigil. I'm there in spirit. We have a common enemy, patriarchy. Oh, they're just a few bad feminists. What do people want? Now's not the time. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your protest. I'm sorry I couldn't attend your vigil. I'm there in spirit. Don't call me transphobic. Stop alienating allies. Have you ever thought about us? Tone it down. I'm an ally. I'm sending you good vibes. I really, really wanted to come, I'm sorry. But unfortunately, I have like 30 messages like this in my inbox. And in front of me, standing next to me, was not a single person other than other trans women. So when you look at just one individual, it might offer an explanation. But when you look at it in the grand summary of things, 2 days before, in the same venue, when there was a motorway case, where I was also there, and I also said something which received a lot of attention, I couldn't see the end of it. I was sitting in front with the mic, and I didn't know where the crowd ended. Whereas over here, there was just an entire vacuum. There's also anger. Oh, I don't know what's happening with the clicker. Let me see if I can use this. Oh. There we go. Okay. I think I'll leave it there for now. I think the slides had a bit of an issue. But yeah. So we went from joy to frustration to despair. Does anyone have an answer for the kind of things that gives a trans person joy? Giving you an indication of what kind of things cause frustration or stronger emotions than that. Now I'll tell you what this silence is. This silence is shame. Pretty sure everyone in this room is feeling ashamed in some way or another. That is your biggest obstacle to epistemic care. Your own shame, your own feeling of inadequacy, of getting something wrong, is your worst enemy. When someone confronts you with something like this, and you feel inadequate, there is often a turning away, a looking away, because it's painful, and it really hurts. Because our sense of self is, we're good people. We really care. We're trying to change the world. We're trying to improve things. But here is someone presenting some evidence that's really difficult to absorb. And this is when I look at all of you and say, yes, I'm angry, but it's okay for you to feel ashamed. The best thing you can do is befriend your shame, to sit with the shame, talk to your shame. What is it telling you? And the best thing you can say to your shame is, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's okay. Making mistakes means I'm doing something. If I'm not making mistakes, it means I'm not trying hard enough. And I'm going to have to deal with the emotional fallout of those mistakes. And that feeling of inadequacy and feeling like I thought I was a good person, but here's some evidence that either I'm going to reject entirely in complete anger, or I'm going to run away from as far as possible, never talk to this person again, hide. Right? And in that space, the reason I didn't call this installation, I call these props, is because the real work wasn't the pieces themselves. It was this conversation that I have now led you to, the conversation about shame. In the gallery, I had googly eyes all over the floor, looking back. And people could not look at the floor. I hadn't stuck them on the floor anyway, so people were like trampling over them, knocking them over, not really knowing how to interact with them. So there was this sense of discomfort and confusion, which a lot of marginalized folks and cis women are used to, that gaze, that staring, which they were confronted with in terms of their eyes being on the floor itself, looking back at them, saying things that perhaps you don't want to hear. So I think I'll take it there. I don't know how much time I've taken.
We have half an hour more for questions and answers.
Yeah. With that incredibly distressing ending, I think before we do Q&A, it might be worth taking a moment. I'd invite you, if you feel comfortable, to close your eyes. And if you don't feel comfortable, to just sort of look down vaguely in one area. And get a sense of what's happening for you as you sit here in this space. Is there a tension somewhere? Is there a heaviness? Is there a lightness? A tightness somewhere? Is there pain? Is there pressure? Is there numbness? No sense of what you're feeling. You're not trying to change any of it. You're just observing. Befriend that feeling. But that's probably your shame talking to you. When you feel it come up, you don't run away from it. You thank it. You tell it, I know you're looking out for me. You're trying to give me a sense of purpose, a sense of stability, a sense of coherence in terms of my person, of my identity as someone who cares, who loves, who fights in certain ways. But it's not the only feeling. You're also looking beyond it. And you might have to say to it, thanks for looking out for me, but I got this. I can sit with the discomfort. Think of the discomfort as an old friend that's visiting. You can imagine it as, something comical. A clown, a big animal. You could wave to it, say hello, hi, you're back. And before we come back into the room, take a few deep breaths. We're going to do triangle breathing, which is 3 breaths in, hold for 3, and then out for 5. So your exhale is longer. So we're going to start. Inhale, 2, 3, hold, 2, 3, exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. One more time. Inhale, 2, 3, exhale. Hold, 2, 3, exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when you're ready, slowly blink your eyes open. And before you look around, just get a sense of the space. What's sticking out to you the most? The temperature, the lighting, the sound. The fear, the pain. You're all valuable individuals who are compassionate and caring. You've just seen some blind spots. And it's going to be a difficult part of a process for you to come to terms with it. But if you do, that's the biggest favor you can do for yourself and for us. Thank you.
You open for questions?
Hmm?
You open for questions?
Yes. Hmm? I'm sorry?
So what gives you joy?
What do I see joy? I'm not going to answer that. That'd be too easy. Yeah?
Talked about anger, like how do you move past that and how do you come here and figure out something I educate them and not the answer.
So are you talking generally or are you talking about my process? Okay. For me, it has been a journey of recognizing the humanity of people who I'm upset with. And knowing that they can only meet me to the extent that they've met themselves. So if I'm looking at a cis man, for example, who is saying really nasty things to me, there will be expressions of femininity that have been suppressed, that when he sees them in me, it's really uncomfortable to sit with. And as a way for him to deal with that discomfort, it is to commit either physical or emotional violence on me. Similarly, when I say in feminist spaces that, I think we need to reevaluate how we are acquiring stories. And it's met with resistance. I know it is about me, but it's also not about me. It's about how far that person has met themselves in terms of their own story. And recognizing that we all have obstacles and seeing the other person's humanity. Of course, it's hard. But I'm fortunate enough to have been trained as a therapist as well. And a mediator, and had to I run these courses where when I talk about these things, in a situation where I have more responsibility for providing care to that person than I might perhaps have in this space. And then they will ask me questions that will reflect their prejudice. And I just have to sit and listen and very gently ask questions that get them to a space where there's genuine exploration. Right? So there might be direct opposition, saying, okay, it's not like this, you're wrong, or how could this be? And when I ask a series of questions about what their assumptions are, it opens up avenues for exploration. So, of course, that requires a lot of patience and grounding yourself. An exercise we did just now is to enable us to sit with that discomfort. Right? The discomfort doesn't necessarily have to be with other people and what they're telling us. It could be about our own stuff. In terms of, I'm really struggling to not want to scream at you right now. For example, I don't want to scream at you, but just give you an example. Did that answer your question, or was that too vague?
But I'm wondering whether, I understand what you're saying. Sometimes, like given the competitive experience or daily basis on a large and macro level in your entire life, how do you sit down and where I'll take this time, I'll take more time, compared to so much time to really sit with yourself, everyone is talking for, and then to get to the point where I'll sit down with another person, somebody who's against me and help them.
I have the privilege of being educated and having savings and time. Until those savings run out, I can do a lot of this free labor. Yeah.
When people are trying to help in any way, if it's in form of activism or anything else, when does it have the opposite effect if it does? When is it not helpful? Is there any point where you was like, it's a bit of like it, which will then? I'm trying to wonder are there forms of help that are just in general?
So I would suggest that your working assumption is that it's not helpful.
Right?
I would suggest that your working assumption is that it's not helpful. And find ways to make it helpful. You know? Because when you start from a place that you need evidence that this is unhelpful, that means you're already shutting yourself out to a lot of lines of inquiry. Right? When we talk about epistemic humility, you approach it saying, I don't know what I don't know. I don't know how to acquire that knowledge or that information. And you ask other people about how they know what they know. It's not just the stories, it's the story behind the stories. I know that's a horrifying thought where you have to sit and look for evidence that it is helping. But that is the shift that we need to make. You know? I want you to imagine, for all the sort of femme-presenting people here, the women here, trying to explain to cis men the struggles that you face, that they don't see, and explain to them the gravity of them, and having to deal with the denials, the frustration, the direct anger. That has parallels to our experience. When I organize in certain spaces, there is that temptation. You know what? This is not enough. I'm just going to go and scream at the side. When there is, just have that sense of beginner's mind. You have ideas, sure, great. Let's look at some others. And let's throw out our ideas in terms of how we can acquire new ones. And it's funny I'm saying this at a university, because universities can be quite specific in terms of how knowledge is acquired. But a lot of marginalized folks will not have been into this space. You know, they will be as far away from the space as possible. They won't be able to talk to you. They wouldn't have read Judith Butler. Not that, I don't know how many people here have read Judith Butler, but you know, I personally struggle. I got through 2 pages and then gave up. Anything else? Anyone else? You can express an emotion or a comment, a frustration. Mm-hmm.
So, thank you so much for the talk. While listening to you, was wondering, so many of us are so familiar with social justice activism as sort of demands-based or rights-based advocacy. I was wondering how you see sort of feminist care work fit in with that. Is that something that is complementary? Is that something that's taking us in a different direction? Do you see the two come together or sort of take us in different directions?
I think they complement each other, but they are fundamentally different. There's knowing and there's ways of knowing. There are different branches of philosophy, there's different branches of exploration, right? So a lot of the times this is being and learning how to be in a particular space. Learning how to be with the discomfort. Learning how to be with the knowledge that you don't, there's so many things you don't know and you don't know how to acquire it. All right? Particularly in when we are very acquainted with sort of the academics or the theories behind feminism and social justice, we can get very carried away and sort of looking at the nuances of the theory, but sort of get lost in the actual ground level impact that it's having. One thing we did do, which is when we did this residency, we had a space in which we invited people to just sit, bring candles, bring paper, bring markers, sit in silence and grieve. Grieve the people that were killed. Grieve what was killed inside you. grieve what was killed in others that affected you. Now, this is a way of knowing that doesn't necessarily have words. Because when you talk to therapists, for example, they'll talk about thoughts and emotions being different languages. It's like trying to speak Japanese to a French person. You sort of cross currents. And just learning to get acquainted with that way of knowing, which doesn't have a equivalent in theory or knowledge in the form of words. Because that's what empathy is. Thank you. Yes? सब आके चुरा रहे हैं. Just be mindful of that. Hmm? No, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as being fully empathetic. Empathy always has limits. Empathy is never at the expense of your own self. There's a temptation to do that, particularly in social justice frameworks that, there's always that you need to be doing more. Why aren't you looking at this? There's always another issue. There's always another level of depth to go into. And this is the care that I haven't talked about, which is looking at your burnout. Because we were talking about epistemic care here. But burnout is also very real in social justice. And taking care of yourself is also very important. So sure, it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole, say, I need to know this, I need to know this, I need to know this, and it's never enough. Sure, there is an element of inquiry, yes. But it also needs to be one which is sustainable. Grounding yourself. Knowing when you are uncomfortable or when your body is actually not performing at its optimum because of the anxiety of not knowing. Yeah? You don't sound convinced. What's going on? Mm-hmm.
Expand on this a little bit, because empathy is a part. Is exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy is a part. Is a resource.
Uh-huh.
Is limited. And then coming from empathy, or this other question about health, they're coming from a resource that is very small. And the problem that existed in the world, including that problem, are much bigger than any of these things.
Yep.
There is no resource, there is absolutely no resource can solve the problem that we face. And the only solution is just going back to the self and then approach it from a place that these kind of resources are not exploited. It's coming from exploitations that we are doing to all our resources, including nature, including trees, including birds, including everything. And when you come from a different place, that is very abstract what I'm saying, but different way of what you said.
Mm-hmm.
If you come from a place that you are included in whatever that you're dealing with, and you don't need to be empathetic in particular, because this is also your situation. My situation is your situation. You're helping me, that means that you're helping yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm helping you because I help myself. And this is not, I don't use that resource of empathy, like this way of connectedness. Am I making sense?
It's interesting you say this, because when we go back to shame, remember your biggest obstacle is not lack of knowledge. Your biggest obstacle is shame. Your biggest obstacle is your own feeling of inadequacy, or the information that contradicts your sense of, your sense of morality, or of yourself as a moral being. And you always have to be mindful of that. That's where you start with. It might be connected with other people, with other forms of oppression or marginalization, but ultimately you're always centered on yourself. Okay, what is it within me that is stopping me from being more healthy in the way I approach this? And when I say healthy, I don't mean very prescriptively, whatever your definition of health is, as expansive as you want. And also exploring that line of epistemic care. You have to do those in parallel. And if there's any point in which your body is suffering as a result, when you're in an airline, they tell people to put on their own mask first before they help someone else. That's what you got to do. And then you have to sit with the discomfort of someone else saying that you're not doing enough. Because there will always be people who are saying that you're not doing enough. When you know that your body can only handle so much. But also being mindful of not getting overwhelmed by the emotion so much that you confuse it with the body. And saying, oh, my body's giving up, when it's actually your shame. It's messy, as you can see. It's really messy. It's really hard to untangle. And we all get lost in it.
Thank you for adding those last few lines to the answer. But so my question is that how do you deal with not being able to be there for someone else and not being able to show empathy even though you really want to, but your body is just not there for you and physically can't, physically don't have the energy to do so. But then you end up feeling even low because you're unable to be there and to express and show empathy.
Is being mindful of what your priorities are. Your priorities are to your own well-being, but at the same time also being mindful of the sum result of that. Right? You don't start using your well-being as an excuse to not take action ever. Because that's a slippery slope that often happens. The poem I actually read out. If you look at every person's response in isolation, it might look valid. But it was really weird to see that there was actually no one there when every person had a valid reason for not being there. But just 2 days earlier, it was a packed audience. So it is very easy to sort of trick our own selves that, I'm just looking after myself. Also being mindful, okay, maybe there might be instances in which you're running away from discomfort. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to, I was wondering if you can expand a little bit. You kind of touched upon this a little bit, but I was wondering if you want to expand on the idea that, so for instance, when you confront someone else's shame through the props that you presented in your work, there is sometimes, actually a lot of times, there's a lot of violence that comes your way. Sometimes it looks like those intrusive questions, other times you feel like some engaged in physical violence. Or at other times it's just this stonewall, like kind of what is happening right now a little bit. How do you take care of yourself when that happens? You are doing a lot of explaining in terms of what this means, and you end up taking care of a lot of people, like you're doing right now for these folks. But how do you take care of yourself?
The basics: diet, exercise, staying away from Facebook comments. because it's really easy to start arguing with strangers on the internet. But also being mindful of the labor that you're doing. You know, I'm aware that there is quite a lot of labor that I've just done, and taking time off for myself. You know, I'm going to fight the temptation to do a full day's work tomorrow. I don't know how well that will go, but I'm going to try to take it easy. Knowing me, it's very easy to get sucked into anything, but also knowing what my own limits are. You know, therapy, I have a supervisor for my counseling practice who also is there to take care of me, and then I have my support system. You know, I will go cry to my friends or my siblings. So it's all the stuff we haven't talked about on the slides, which is the physical care.
Yeah. Just a follow-up. I'm so glad that you made the invisible visible right now, and I was wondering, in your experience, how much the mainstream like feminist spaces actually make room for this kind of work and this practice literally this entire ecosystem of care. How much do mainstream feminist spaces, particularly in Pakistan, make space for all of this?
So I'm convinced that this kind of work is hyper-local. You're looking at a group of 5 people, 10 people, and you're working intensively with them, right? I might have flown here from another city, but I'm very conscious that this is just surface level stuff. You know, you're not really acquainted with the nuances of transness or neurodivergence, which is the stuff I talk about, because I didn't really go into the nitty-gritty. I was talking about general principles. So in a sense, I haven't really created advocates or allies in that sense of the word. I've just given people an opportunity to go on their own path of exploration where they can acquire the skills to actually do that work. And frankly, there might be 1 person in here, 2, who will actually do it. It's just the sad reality of how this works. Yeah. So it is and it isn't a numbers game. You know, when you're looking at hyperlocal work, you're working very intensively with some people, but also knowing that even when you're working very intensively with, say, a group of 5, how many will be able to carry that flame, that torch forward? You've got to be realistic. It's not going to be a lot. Looking at a small minority. And I know a lot of people are going to be really upset to hear that. But let's have this conversation in a year. See what everyone has done. And when you divorce yourself from that expectation that everyone has to be a convert, that's when you start taking care of yourself better. Because then you're not invested in individual results. You're looking at the bigger picture. You know, if I start looking at all the work that I've done and all the individuals I've worked with and the collective impact of that, collective impact will make it easier for me to find meaning. But if I start getting invested in each individual, I'm going to be incredibly frustrated. Yeah?
I just want to share this feeling of discomfort that I had, particularly about the question of joy, and I'm thankful that you invoked that discomfort because it's hard for me to, imagine joy in a way that is particular to you, but it is also common to us because trust me, I'm not so it's a tricky thing for me to imagine that they are humans, so they should find joy in whatever every other human being finds in joy, like music, like food, like dance, like I don't know, fashion. But at the same time, it becomes a concern that am I subsuming their joy and their mind the same way that patriarchy or common enemy does. So it's really a discomfort.
So where are you going to look for that knowledge? About trans women's joy?
Reading more about them, knowing more about them,
As
seeing their
separate from you as strangers on the internet? Okay. How many trans women are close friends of people? If they're not part of your inner circle, there are ways of knowing that you are not exposed to. And that's what I challenge people every time. Don't think of us as distant, an object to be studied from a distance. Become our friends. Take us out for lunch, have some chai, let us vent. Sometimes our venting will be really difficult to hear because it'll have something to do with you. But that's what you need to do. Yeah? More discomfort, I'm guessing. But that discomfort is your friend. Because if you run away from it, then you're doing everyone a disservice. And it's growing pains. Someone want to scream into the void?
Maybe if there isn't a final question, we can stop here. How do you feel now?
Yeah. You can always reach out to me. Best way is probably email, spectrumpeace@gmail.com. I do have social media, which I believe would have been circulated. And I can always direct you to resources. But the best resources are people that you won't have interacted with before, either because you wouldn't have physically been in a space that they occupy, or you would have just sort of completely not engaged with someone that you see in your regular life. That's your best resource, not me. You know, I'm more like you than most trans women, right? I'm only going to be able to tell you my story as much as I try to convey other people's, because I also don't know what I don't know and how I don't know, because I also have class privilege. You know, I'm an educated trans woman, whereas a working class trans woman will have entirely different stories, and she might actually be angry at me for telling my story. You know, and that's valid too. Yeah. Thank you very much.